looking at 2 Samuel chapter 7 for a portion of the lesson this morning. And today we are going to continue looking at the book of Samuel. In our Bible, it's 1st and 2nd Samuel. It would be a long book if it was all together. It really does tell one story. And of course, all the books in the Bible fit together to tell an even greater story. And it's kind of some of what we want to try to be showing as we go through the Bible this year. Last week we began looking at the book of Samuel, and I can't remember that I mentioned this. When we've been looking at these books, I've kind of mentioned who's the author and all of that. We might think that Samuel is the author, and I think Samuel did write some of it, but for a major portion of the book, for the 2nd Samuel, the second part of the book, Samuel is dead. So it was either very stunning prophecy, which it could have been, but that's not the normal kind of prophecy that we see the other prophets giving. We'll take a little time in a week or two to kind of explain what I think is happening here, and I'll just mention it here. And there's a succession of prophets. Samuel was a prophet. We know today we're going to talk about Nathan the prophet. We remember maybe reading about Gad and these other prophets. And but just the books of the Old Testament, most of these, even the history books, most likely written by the prophets of Israel. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a future week. But anyway, we have Samuel here. The setting of it is, of course, Israel's been redeemed out of Egypt in Exodus, and then also in Exodus, God makes a covenant with Israel and makes them, we might say, His people. They then conquer Canaan, and after the conquest of Canaan, they are left to continue to drive out the pagans, the heathen, from the land. They're not to mix with them. They're not to worship their gods or anything like that. And they don't. So the tribes of Israel, they take in the beginning of Judges, we see them taking their turns, we might say, or it's probably all at once, but the author tells us how one went to clear out their land and failed, and another went and failed. And then we begin to read the history of the people of Israel under Judges. And Judges was a time of, maybe we would say, kind of like tribal chieftains. There was somebody who rose to power within a tribe, and some other tribes around them would go and seek his judgment in important issues. He would rally men together and defend Israel. If we're just thinking about it in that way, of course, Judges shows us this downward spiral of the people of Israel. They had peace, they sinned and followed the gods of the land around them. Then they would be oppressed by their enemies. They would cry out to God, and God would send a deliverer who would deliver them from their enemies and give them a time of peace, and then it would start over again. But anyway, in Judges is a very messy book. Lots of messes going on there, lots of awful things, troubling actually. And we get to the end of the book, and it's almost like a climax of this awfulness. And then we read Ruth, and we can see that even in all of that mess, God is still working in the midst of Israel. It's just a little family here in Bethlehem that He's working in, but we see that God is working in the midst of all that chaos. And then we come to Samuel, and Samuel, the books of Samuel, or Samuel, tells us the story of a transition from the chaos of Judges, the judge-type rule, all the way to Israel being a nation, we might say. In Judges, Israel is several tribes. They're a people, but at the end of Samuel, they're a nation. They have one king, they have a capital city, they have a religious center in the capital city, and they're all united under their king. And the books of Samuel tell us this. I mentioned last week that Samuel starts out with like a first section on Samuel, and then a larger section on Saul, and the section on Saul is kind of divided in half. And then 2 Samuel continues a large section on David, and that section on David is in half. And then at the end of 2 Samuel is what we might call an epilogue. And so we learn about Samuel, and then we learn about Saul. Saul rises, and then he falls. When we get to the end of 1 Samuel, he's died a gruesome death. He's taken his own life, lost in battle. The people of Israel are scattered. They've been defeated by the Philistines. But while Saul is falling in influence and power, David is rising. At Saul's height of power and pride, he disobeys God, and God says, I've chosen someone else to take your place. Samuel anoints David, and he begins to rise in power, or in influence, we might say. We get into 2 Samuel, and David continues to, what we might say, ride this wave of influence and power through the first 10 chapters of Samuel. I'll just go into, we'll start there. So, in the beginning of 2 Samuel, David is told of Saul's death and the defeat of Israel, and really, in something, we read it over and over again, so it's no surprise to us. But this is really stunning that David mourns. Here's the man who's been chasing him all over the countryside, trying to kill him. And David mourns the death of Saul and, of course, and of Jonathan. He mourns his persecutor's death. He writes a poem in their honor, we might say, where he says, how are the mighty fallen? And then he moves to Hebron, which is in Judah, his own tribe, and the men of Judah anoint him as king. But not all Israel does that. He's in Hebron, and there's a battle then. There's various battles between the family of Saul, Ishbosheth, and his captain of the guard, Abner, and Daniel. Why do I keep saying Daniel? Sorry. David. But after a while there, Abner says, all of Israel loves you. We should just end these battles and come together. And all of Israel does come to David and say, be our king, and he is their king. And as that happens, he establishes his capital in Jerusalem. We talked a little bit last week about how Jerusalem was quite a strategic move also, not being a city that was the possession of any of the tribes. And in chapter 6 of 2 Samuel, David moves the religious center, we might say, in a sense, to Jerusalem. Now, the tabernacle was still up in, I think, Gibeah, or it was not Gibeah, Shiloh. It was not in Jerusalem. But David had built a tent in Jerusalem where he could worship God. And of course, the ark wasn't with the tabernacle, and the ark wasn't in Jerusalem. David gets the ark and moves it to Jerusalem. So the Ark of the Covenant, moving to Jerusalem, he's setting up Jerusalem as a religious center. It's a political center and a religious center of Israel. And chapter 7, where we finished last week, David says, God, you have blessed me so much. I'm settled in as a kingdom. I have a beautiful palace. I have a ceiling over my head, but you still dwell in tents. I want to build a house for you, which of course he means a temple for God. And God replies, actually, David's prophet says, it's a good idea. Go do everything that's in your heart. And then God speaks to the prophet and says, go and talk to David. And that's in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel. And let's just pick up let's say verse 8. He's before this, God is saying, I never asked for a temple or for a house of cedar. In verse 8 he says, Now therefore so shalt thou say unto my servant David, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I took thee from the sheepcote, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. And I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off all thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are in the earth. And the Lord, and then go down to the end of verse 11. And the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee a house. Okay, so David says, I want to make you a house. God says, I never asked for a house. I brought you from nothing, and I'm going to make you a house. And now let's continue. What does he mean by that in verse 12? And when thy days be fulfilled, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers. And thou shalt sleep with thy fathers. I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thy house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so did Nathan speak unto David. Okay, so this chapter really, or this chapter, or what happens here in this particular, what we just read, is very key to understanding what's going on in the Bible. Remember, in the very beginning, God created man, and man rebelled against God, and in that rebellion, God promised a deliverer. There would be a mighty warrior that would crush the head of the serpent while having his heel injured, bruised by the serpent. There's somebody that's coming. There's this promise. And then Abraham, when we come to Abraham, Abraham is told, I'm going to bless all the nations through you. All the nations will be blessed through you. And now we come to this spot, and this is another further development of seeing what God is doing, what God is telling in the Bible. Of course, David is one of the children of Abraham, but God says to David, I'm going to make you a house. Okay, that's not a temple. David already has a house to live in. He means, I'm going to give you a dynasty. You're going to have a king, you're going to have a son, and he will be a king. And I'm going to establish a kingdom, an eternal kingdom. Okay, no one has an eternal kingdom but David. So he says, you're going to have an eternal kingdom. And so we're gathering that this person, then the prophets pick up this promise to David. We see it referred to in different of the Psalms, David himself, and so Psalm 2, Psalm 72, Psalm 132, Psalm 145. But then Isaiah 11 picks it up some. And okay, Isaiah 11 is really an important thing for us to see. In the very beginning it says, there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might. So this, Isaiah is telling us about the servant of the Lord, the Messiah, the anointed one, and he's saying this is coming out of the stem of Jesse. Who's the stem of Jesse? David. Okay, so the prophets are saying this promise of God to David is God is revealing more of his plan. He's going to bless the world through a king that is from David's line. David will have a kingdom, he will have a dynasty, and eventually, and it will be eternal kingdom. We don't know, right here in 2 Samuel, we don't know all the details of it, The prophets develop it more for us. Ezekiel 34 develops it some more. Zechariah develops it some more. But this promise, as we look back or as we look over what the Bible is teaching us, this is important because it's not just the people of Abraham. It's not just the Israelite people. It's going the blessing to the nations of God. The blessing of God to the nations is going to come through the seed of David, and it'd be one of his a king from his line. Well, so that happens in chapter 7. Chapter 8, 9, and 10 tell us some more of David's military victories. And then we have the awful, terrible event where David, in the midst of all this blessing, he sins with Bathsheba. And we said, we see the rise of David and the ride of David, and then we see kind of the fall of David. There's the sin with Bathsheba, and then the horrible cover-up. I mean, I don't mean to cheapen it, but what is worse? You sin with someone, with a man's wife, and then the conniving that took place to try to cover that up, and eventually so whatever, full of pride and not wanting people to know, that had the man killed. And it wasn't like people didn't know. I don't think David, in fact, the Bible doesn't tell us that David sent his servants to her house. Nathan says the Gentiles know about this mess that's going on when he talks to him. But it's an awful mess. And then chapter 12, we have the confrontation from Nathan. Nathan comes to him, tells him this story, and David is all angry over a man who takes someone's sheep, says he's going to have to repay him fourfold. And Nathan says, "Thou art the man." I have to laugh because I'll just tell a side story here. The world is so, they're so clueless. I was listening to the radio, 15, 20 years ago, and the talk show host was talking to the sports announcer whose name was David, and he said he found him in the Bible. And he said, it's right there in 2 Samuel chapter 12. It says, "David, you are the man." And he thought that was great. I was like, buddy, that is not the time that you want to be the man. But it's the world. That is a trouble. That is trouble with not looking at context, and not looking at, anyway, he wasn't looking at the King James Version because he wouldn't have said thou. He said, "You are the man." He said, "David, you are the man." I'm like, okay, I don't want to be that man. But anyway, so they thought it was great. Anyway, back to the scriptures, back in context. Nathan says, "You are the man, thou art the man." David says, "I've sinned." Of course, Saul had said, "I'd sinned" a lot of times, but when David truly repents of his sin, and God forgives him, but he says, the consequences of your sin cannot be stopped. And we see, I don't know that he says it, but we see a fourfold punishment. David took Uriah's life. The child died. Amnon was killed by his brother. Absalom was killed by Joab. And is it Abinadab? Adonijah was killed by Solomon in that transition period. So 4 of David's sons die or are killed here. And that's all just part of this downfall, we might say, of David. Now, God had promised David, it's not like, so Saul's family falls and it's off the scene, kind of. God keeps his promise to David. But I referred to it, right soon after this, we see Amnon and Tamar, and Amnon violates Tamar. Amnon, I believe, is David's firstborn. You can look through the genealogies, do help us with that. That's exciting reading. And then Absalom is Tamar's brother, so he takes extra interest in this, jealousy, rightful actually jealousy of his sister, but then he takes Amnon's own life, And then Absalom schemes for years, not 40 years, but he schemes for many years until he steals the heart of the kingdom away from David. These are the people that Saul's killed his thousands, David's killed his tens of thousands. But now Absalom has stolen their heart, and he rebels against his own father. He's trying to drive his dad out of Jerusalem, and he wants to rule in Jerusalem. I cannot comprehend it, but it's happening. Absalom is trying to drive his own father out from being king. And then there's the war. There's a war there between the followers of Absalom and those that were still loyal to David. And in that war, in those battles, Joab kills Absalom. And here again, we're stunned by David's grief. The people are stunned by it. Sometimes you say, well, it was his son, but it was the man that was going to kill him. His own son was going to kill him. It wasn't like it was somebody from another tribe. His own son wanted to kill him and drive him from the throne. And he's wailing, "Oh, Absalom, Absalom, my son, Absalom." And it does hurt the people of Israel. I think we as Americans, 3,000 years later, we can't understand the cultural setting that was in there, and what's taking place in those scenes. But it hurt the people of Israel. And Joab's a pretty shrewd guy. He's not a godly man like David would be, but he reports to David, "Hey, put your clothes on and get in the gate and judge the people. They're scattered. If you want to be the king, But anyway, so there's this stunning grief, and the end of David's life, he's on the throne, but it's just kind of like he's there, and there's nothing. There's just this happens. There's no. He's a broken man. And then that brings us to the end of Samuel. The last 4 chapters of Samuel is kind of the epilogue, and it's kind of crafted in this way. In chapter 21a and in chapter 24, we're told about the failures of the first 2 kings of Israel. We're told the failure of Saul, how he harmed the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites come, and we're told about that, and David makes that right. And these things in the end, most people would say, are not necessarily in chronological order. They're kind of telling some things, ending the book. And then in chapter 24, we're told about another failure of David's. When he numbered the people, he injured the people of Israel by numbering them, and there's a plague on the people of Israel. And that is actually the event that begins the process of moving the tent and the whole temple process to Mount Moriah, which is just north of the city of David. So, we had this tent that David set up. We have Shiloh. We have the Ark of the Covenant in the tent. And then this event that's recorded for us in the end of Samuel is when David goes and buys the threshing floor of Araunah. He's got 2 names there. The Jebusite, and that place is where the temple ends up being built. So we have that, and then in chapter 21b, right after the story of Saul's failure, and in chapter 23b, right before the story of David's failure, we have 2 separate stories of David and his mighty men. And both of these stories show David as a weak, vulnerable man. There's the one where there's fighting the Philistines, and he faints in the battle, and his mighty men save him from the giants. And then there's the other story of him being in the hold or somewhere and longing for the water from the well of Bethlehem. And right in the middle of this kind of literary design, chapter 22 and the beginning of chapter 23 are two poems that David writes that are kind of a memoir-type poems. And in those poems, David remembers God's grace. He reminds those that are reading it that God is faithful to his promises, to his covenant promise, and both of the poems refer to the hope for a future king, or refer to this eternal, this forever kingdom that God had promised David. And so these two poems at the end of 2 Samuel direct us back to thinking about the promise that God gave David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and even bring us back all the way to the beginning, chapter 2, Hannah's poem after she had been blessed by God with Samuel, how she said, how she, in that poem, talks about how God opposes the prideful and opposes evil, and exalts the humble. He, even though men are evil, he continues his work, and that he promises a king. So the whole book of Samuel is all tied together with Hannah's poem in the beginning and David's poems at the end. And through it, we do see, and we should remember, despite the evil of men, despite people doing their own thing, God still works. God is working today, even though evil things are happening. God opposes pride. He opposed Saul's pride. He opposed David's pride. He opposes Israel's pride. And when they're, hauling the Ark of the Covenant out. He opposes all pride, and he exalts the humble. And those are the things that we can gain from the big picture of the book of Samuel.